Welcome back, everyone. This week we'll be talking about the intersectional perspective, specifically looking at the medical field and health and illness. But the intersectional perspective or intersectional theory is really a core concept to sociology as an entire field. Intersectional theory, or the intersectional perspective, looks at how different identity categories combine to create a unique person and their unique experiences. So every single person has a variety of different identities that make up who they are. Every person has a race, ethnicity, socioeconomic status, age, gender identity, sexuality, sexual orientation, disability status, religion or no religion, and so on and so forth. And it's really the intersection of all of these different identity categories coming together to create a unique person that intersectional theory is focused on. We want to look at how a person's experiences and their life and the opportunities, rights, and resources afforded to them are affected by that combination of different identity factors. I have a quote here from one of our authors saying, "Intersectional analysis recognizes oppressions do not occur in isolation and instead are mutually constituted." What this means is that we can't look just at race and health or just at socioeconomic status and health. If we're looking at oppression in any area, we need to take into account how a person's identity is affected by their other identities as well. If we're researching women and the healthcare experiences that they have or the treatment experiences that they have, we need to make sure that we're looking at women of different races, women of different socioeconomic statuses, different ages, and so on and so forth, so that we have a representative and well-rounded sample to better understand the reality of what's happening for that population that we're interested in. Intersectionality is really core to sociology for so many reasons, but primarily because it just gives us that better, well-rounded picture of any kind of sociological phenomena. Another quote from our author here says, "Unidimensional analysis, or examining only race or only gender, misses multidimensional identities that make some populations more vulnerable." And I really want to call attention to that last part of the quote, more vulnerable. For a lot of individuals, they have what we would call a multiply marginalized identity. And that means someone who has multiple different identities, say their race and their gender and their class, or so on, are identities that are historically and currently oppressed or disenfranchised in our society. This little graph or infographic on the side of the slide here shows us how all these different things can kind of overlap and intersect and create this very unique person at the very center there. If a person has a race, say if they are a Black or Indigenous or person of color, they are going to experience racism in our society. They may be of high socioeconomic status and not experience classism, but maybe they also experience ableism because they have a disability. Maybe they are an older adult, and so they're also experiencing ageism, especially people in like their senior years. So when we have that more vulnerable population or these people who have multiply marginalized identities, we really want to focus on what's happening for those communities and those individuals when we're looking at sociological phenomena, especially health and illness. It's really important that we get the whole picture of a person and all of the components and parts that make up them, that make up their identity, and then we look at how certain groups and certain people are experiencing more oppression, more hardship, more disenfranchisement under the kinds of systems and structures that we all live under in our society. Now, a lot of those identity categories are social constructs. Gender, race, ethnicity, class, all of these different things are labels that we have created as a culture, as a society, and so while they're not necessarily rooted in anything like biological or this scientific objective reality, the existence of these categorizations has really real-world impacts. So just because something is socially constructed, it is made up, it is created by humans, but it's not imaginary. The impact of these categories is very, very real. And so while race and gender and these other categories are social constructs, the lived reality of being a person who is racialized, who experiences racism, or the lived reality of experiencing misogyny or transphobia and so on and so forth, that is very real, very difficult, and very impactful. So while these identity categories are something that we created as humans, that doesn't make them any less real. I'd like to call attention now to a theory called discrit theory. This is really core to sociology of medicine and social health and illness. Discrit theory is a combination of disability studies and critical race studies into one theory. So we're combining critical race theory and disability studies into one perspective that is a bit more well-rounded and complex than either of those theories alone. Very importantly, we're looking here at the co-construction of race and disability. So not just the social construction of race and not just the social construction of disability or ability, we are looking at how these two concepts are interrelated. If you think for a moment, how are race and disability connected? You may or may not be able to come up with some examples, and we will talk about quite a few examples through this lecture, but that intersection is really unique, right? When we're looking at people of different races with the same disability, or people of the same race with different disabilities, or how people's lives look when they have multiply marginalized identities as a racialized and disabled person. There are a lot of different things that we can see for this population, and this theory is going to let us really dive into what those experiences look like, what the reality is for sociological phenomena for this population. Some background information that really is the foundation for this theory is this co-construction of race and disability has been happening for centuries. The link between these two concepts or these two identity factors goes back for hundreds of years. There's a lot of overlap between scientific research that was both racist and ableist that gave us a lot of what we have today in the medical field. You may or may not be familiar with the practice of phrenology. This was a kind of 1800s and earlier practice of measuring different parts of the body, particularly the skull, to try to find different ways that the body could be shaped or a person could be kind of built, and how that could be related to like personality traits, intelligence, capabilities. And this was, of course, a pseudoscience. There is nothing about the shapes of the bumps of your bones or your skull or the length of your fingers or anything like that that really tells us anything at all about who you are. But during that period of time, phrenologists were engaging in scientific racism, where they were measuring people of different races, taking these different data points, and coming to the false conclusion that certain data points from certain bodies, especially Black individuals' bodies, were so-called evidence of less intelligence or other kinds of negative traits. This was really, a so-called scientific way of framing racism as some kind of valid or scientifically backed perspective. Of course, during that period of time, if we're looking at these racist practices and we're seeing how these people are justifying, in a sense, their racism, a lot of it was through ableism. And so saying, that people of a certain race are less intelligent or perhaps have intellectual or developmental disabilities in comparison to white individuals, which of course is not true, but that is directly linked to the devaluation of people with lower intelligence and the devaluation of people with intellectual disabilities hand in hand with racism. So this link between racism and ableism, or between race and disability through science or pseudoscience, goes back for a very, very long time. We also see, of course, throughout history and even more recently, examples of eugenics and genocide. We talked quite a bit about what eugenics is in a previous lecture, but as a reminder, eugenics is the practice of trying to control the human population, or what the makeup of the population looks like, by increasing or decreasing the prevalence of people with certain so-called desirable or undesirable traits. Eugenics and genocide go hand in hand. Genocide is often used as a means of killing people with so-called undesirable traits as a practice of eugenics. And so throughout our history, we have seen a lot of examples of genocide for eugenic purposes against Black and Indigenous and people of color, and as well as against disabled individuals. So that link goes, again, those things are very hand in hand. A lot of the time, people who are both people of color and disabled experience this combined multiple marginalization that leads to a very heightened increased risk of experiencing this kind of victimization. So this co-construction of race and disability and how scientists come to understand these concepts and how our society treats people in these disenfranchised groups is really linked in a way that we cannot separate. I again have a quote from one of our authors this week saying, "The legacy of historical beliefs about race and ability, which were clearly based on white supremacy, have become intertwined in complex ways that can carry into the present day." And we'll talk about some more examples of how these problematic beliefs and practices have affected modern medical practicing and our current understandings of these concepts as well. I expanded on this a little bit on the previous slide, but we have this idea that disability or being disabled is always this bad, tragic thing that we should try to avoid. And when we have this belief that disability is always bad, and we are equating a lot of people's experiences, especially people of color's experiences or existences with disability, we are both being ableist towards people of color and devaluing disability in a way that is racist. So this combination is really, really volatile. With this assumption that disability is bad, we see a lot of racist stereotypes taking that assumption and running with it as, again, a way to try to justify, in a way, racist beliefs. So we hear a lot of like anti-Black stereotypes about Black individuals being less intelligent or having things like reduced physical pain, like different physiological experiences or different bodies, like the biology of Black individuals being different, particularly from white individuals. And that idea is, of course, completely false. That comes from this long history of scientific racism, things like phrenology. There's been a lot of genocide linked to these kinds of ideas. And so, again, this relationship is very volatile, and this way of understanding both race and or disability can be very dangerous. We also see, even in modern times, that immigrant individuals, people who are especially migrating to the United States, especially English second language learners, are very often stereotyped as less intelligent individuals. This, of course, is completely unfair, very racist, very xenophobic, and also ableist. This devaluation of people with lower intelligence as an insult towards people who are part of an immigrant population. I want to call attention to this little screenshot here on the screen. I believe this was a Twitter post from someone saying, "Someone with broken English likely knows every single word that you know, but in a different language. They literally know tens of thousands of more words than you. Think about that the next time you question someone's intelligence for struggling with the only language you know." Clearly this is aimed at people who only speak English, but that's definitely something worth thinking about, right? We have these assumptions and these stereotypes, these very negative, harmful stereotypes, and even insults that are, of course, racist and xenophobic, but they're also ableist in kind of a roundabout way. We also see this incidence of a lot of BIPOC students being put into special ed programs at higher rates than white students, except for Asian students. So Asian students tend not to be a part of that pattern. And the reason for that is because of racist stereotypes. We have the model minority stereotype about Asian American individuals, the idea that, the stereotype that Asian people are smarter than average or are excellent students. Of course, that can be true, but stereotypes are never true across the board. And so that overgeneralization to a population is always harmful and damaging. And what we're seeing here with these beliefs about intelligence and capability, these ableist kind of assumptions that low intelligence is a very negative thing, or that people of color are more likely to fall into a category of lower intelligence people, or are more likely to have intellectual or developmental disabilities. All of these assumptions mixed together give us, again, this very problematic, racist, and ableist kind of perspective that we are running from, or that we are working from and running with in our society. Again, this so-called justification for slavery during the period that slavery was legal in the United States, this very often relied on these same ableist attitudes. A lot of individuals tried to, kind of use science. It was pseudoscience, but they tried to use what they thought of as science at the time to prove that this was something that was okay. And of course, that was not reliable research. That was not legitimate data that they were working with. They were working with a lot of assumptions and a lot of very problematic and biased reasons, definitely a huge conflict of interest in conducting research to try to prove that what they were doing was justifiable in some way. So we saw a lot of stereotypes during the slavery period that Black individuals feel less physical pain or are less intelligent or have stronger bodies. There were even people saying things like that Black individuals need the structure and control of slavery. Obviously, these are absolutely horrible, atrocious things. There were a lot of medical experimentation happening on enslaved individuals, and just this massive devaluation of disabled people, especially enslaved individuals who became disabled. The hardships and the abuses that people were facing in that situation were absolutely just unspeakable offenses. And so this combination of racism and ableism, this devaluation of disabled people, the fact that being enslaved leads to disabilities because of the abuse and the hard labor that people are enduring, this combination of disability and race is just really, really inseparable and a very traumatic, tragic, and just absolutely disgusting part of American history. Looking a little deeper at these examples of scientific racism and the same kinds of beliefs that would lead people to partake in phrenology or other related practices, we have this concept of atavism, which refers to a person or a group reverting back to earlier stages of human evolution. This obviously is not something that happens. This is a concept that was created through all those other problematic beliefs and ideologies that we've been discussing, but this concept of atavism was used to kind of, again, support these problematic beliefs and ideas. There was this assumption that BIPOC individuals were so-called atavistic or less evolved, particularly compared to white individuals. So this very racist but pseudoscientific belief that was used to try to justify racism at that period in time. This is also a term that is very often applied to people with Down syndrome. We also have seen throughout our history anti-miscegenation laws. These are laws against interracial relationships. Of course, we no longer have anti-miscegenation laws federally in the United States, but interracial marriage was not federally legalized until 1967. That is very recent. I'm sure a lot of us in this class have family members, parents, grandparents, or even ourselves who were around at the time that that happened. So this is far too recent for comfort in human history, in US history, because these laws were they were very widespread. And they were based on these assumptions that multiracial individuals would be disabled or would be inferior in some way. So this very eugenicist kind of perspective that, of course, did lead directly to genocide and eugenics practices in a lot of different ways. There were forced sterilizations happening throughout the United States all the way up until the 1970s, of particularly women of color, but especially disabled women of color. This direct, blatant attempt to try to reduce the number of people in the population who have those identities. So these kinds of laws, these kinds of concepts, and these kinds of beliefs were very widespread throughout US history, and the effects of these things is still echoing through even the modern day. We, of course, also see a lot of xenophobia and racism and ableism toward immigrant populations in the United States. If you're familiar with Ellis Island, that was a very popular hub for migrants to stop at to go through their intake as they were migrating into the United States, especially in like the 1800s. During this period of time, there was, of course, a lot of racism happening. People from different regions were being turned away because of their skin color or their national origin, but people were also being turned away for ableist reasons. I have on the side of the slide here a list of some chalk letters that were being used at immigration stations, like places like Ellis Island. People would arrive usually by boat, and they would be inspected in this very kind of invasive way by immigration officials. People would often be stripped of their clothing, and their bodies would be inspected by complete strangers to search for illnesses or disabilities. If someone was found to have some kind of illness or disability, or they were perceived to have some kind of illness or disability, these chalk letters would be drawn on them, usually on their back where they couldn't see, like on the back of their shoulder, as a way to signal to the other immigration officials that that person was unfit to immigrate, right? That they were going to be put back on a boat and sent away and not permitted to enter the United States. And this was done on the assumption that people would become, quote, public charges, on the idea that these individuals who had disabilities would not be able to work, would not be able to contribute to the economy. This very neoliberal capitalist kind of attitude, really valuing that productivity over human life. And so the practices at Ellis Island were, again, this very lovely combination of both racist and ableist. We do also still see this happening today in kind of a different setting. If we look at the US-Mexico border and the treatment of immigrants in the detention centers at the border, it's very similar in a lot of ways. It is very, very problematic in so many ways, where we are seeing, of course, a lot of xenophobia and racism directed towards people, especially coming from Mexico. The separation of children from their parents, just absolutely inhumane conditions. And again, these kinds of conditions do directly lead to disability. The injuries that people might sustain and the trauma that people will sustain in these kinds of situations and environments is disabling. And so we see racism leading to disability, which then, of course, brings up ableism in the practices directed towards those individuals. And it's kind of this really dangerous feedback loop between these two very problematic ideologies that are very directly harming these kinds of populations. Switching gears now to talk a little bit about the co-construction of gender and disability. We have a long history of the social construction of gender and the social construction of disability overlapping, particularly ableism and misogyny overlapping. Throughout history, women and people who are not men, so this can also be gender nonconforming individuals and transgender individuals, but of course in the 1800s, a lot of the time those identities were being overlooked. So we can look at women in a lot of these historical examples, since that was kind of the language that they might have been using at the time. So women have historically been framed as disabled in a variety of ways. We have this concept of hysteria. If you're not familiar with this, hysteria is essentially like a catch-all term that was used for a lot of even recent human history and US history to kind of just describe anything that was going wrong for someone who was a woman. So regardless of what kind of symptoms that person was having, it was kind of just chalked up to essentially like it's all in your head, or you're just a woman, that's normal, this is just hysteria, you're just kind of a little bit crazy. Just obviously a very dismissive, very problematic, very ableist kind of perspective. Women also were not allowed to drive for a lot of human history. Well, since cars were invented anyway, there weren't cars for a lot of human history, but women were not allowed to drive until far, far after men had been driving for quite some time. They were also considered to be too unintelligent to vote, too emotional to hold a political office, and so on. I'm sure we've all heard these misogynistic and sexist kind of arguments about women and how women are, or stereotypes about the things that women can and cannot do. a lot of the time these kinds of beliefs are rooted not just in misogyny, but medical misinformation. Particularly if we look at the example of women not being allowed to drive, the reason why that was not allowed earlier on was because of scientific misinformation and just a complete lack of understanding of women's bodies, and this belief that if women were to drive, their uteruses would bounce around the inside of their bodies and it would cause a lot of health problems. And of course, we know now that is not at all how that anatomy functions, but women were being left out of medical research, and women were becoming disabled because of a lot of the experiences and discrimination that they were going through, and that was really just not being addressed by society or by the science. Here is a very misogynistic example of some anti-suffrage kind of propaganda, I guess we could say, from the either late 1800s to early 1900s. And I'm sorry it's a little bit blurry on the screen here. It's a little bit blown out and pixelated, but we have one great example here, the fourth one down. It says, "Control of the temper makes a happier home than control of elections." There was a lot of information like this being put out. There was a lot of misinformation and just people really, really pushing against this idea that women should be allowed to vote, that women are capable of making decisions, that women are intelligent enough to understand politics, and so on and so forth. And of course, we do still hear those kinds of arguments today, and those are rooted in, of course, again, misogyny, but also this belief that people of lower intelligence are less worthy of participating in society, or that people who have perhaps intellectual or developmental disabilities should not be allowed to vote, should not have a say in the community that they're a part of. And that is, of course, very ableist and very problematic. What we tend to see happen when we have this combination of both ableism and another kind of discrimination, so ableism and misogyny, or ableism and transphobia, so on and so forth, we see a lot of the time that the group that is being kind of attributed this disability status will reject that association. And so a lot of women during the suffrage movement were saying, we are not disabled, we are not too unintelligent to vote, we are perfectly capable, right? Really rejecting this association with disability and saying, this is not true, this is not true. And that indirectly and very much unintentionally, I believe, devalues disability and kind of reinforces the idea that people who do have lower intelligence should not be allowed to vote, that perhaps people who are disabled deserve to be oppressed, that people with intellectual or developmental disabilities, maybe they should be disallowed the vote, maybe they should be disallowed that participation, but we should not be. We should have suffrage. We should be able to vote. And this kind of pits communities against each other, but it also kind of overlooks that intersectional perspective of all of the women who wanted the vote who were also disabled people. And so again, discriminated against groups and oppressed groups can work together in ways that further everybody's opportunities and push everybody closer to access to rights and access to resources without kind of stepping on each other to get where they want to be. So that co-construction of gender and disability, when women decided, we're going to eschew this label, we're going to reject this association with disability, instead of embracing the disabled community and saying, hey, some of us do have disabilities and we still deserve the right to vote, and really just making a home for everyone with those different identities within that movement. Switching gears again to talk about the co-construction of sexuality or sexual orientation and disability, we often see that people who are not cisgender or not heterosexual, who we could call non-cishet individuals, have often been framed as disabled. So we hear very often these ideas that people who are transgender or gender nonconforming, or people who are not heterosexual, people who are gay or lesbian or bisexual or queer of a variety of different kinds, that those individuals are mentally ill, that there's something often psychologically wrong with that person. That was the assumption, stereotype anyway. For a lot of our history, it was seen as abnormal if someone was not cisgender or was not straight. It's been very recent that we've seen more acceptance of transgender and gender nonconforming or non-binary individuals. It's been very recent that we've seen more acceptance of everyone in the LGBTQIA plus community. This has been a very long time coming, and there's still a really long way to go for this community. We've seen a lot of medicalization of these different identities. The DSM, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Illnesses, kind of the book that psychologists and psychiatrists use to diagnose, had homosexuality as a diagnosis until 1973. Again, that's pretty recent in our history. We also still have gender identity disorder in the DSM right now today. So the medicalization and the pathologization of queerness, of transgender people, of queer individuals, anyone who's not straight, anyone who's not cisgender, this pathologization is directly linked to disability, health and illness. And what we see is that ableism can infiltrate into these other kinds of isms, and we can suddenly have a very ableist version of homophobia or a very ableist version of transphobia. We did also, of course, see this during the 1980s and 90s during the HIV and AIDS epidemic. HIV and AIDS, of course, was contributing to disability for a lot of individuals within the queer community, and the research was kind of not there. The medical field and society were kind of demonizing and pathologizing and stigmatizing the community, and in some ways acting as if it was deserved. And so the health impacts alone of the homophobia, transphobia, and ableism that kind of came into combination during that circumstance was very, very dangerous. It was especially volatile for the community, and the effects of that are still happening today. I'd like to move on now to another example of the co-construction of socioeconomic status and disability. A lot of the time we see low SES groups framed as disabled in terms of especially intelligence. Again, we see this pattern over and over and over, this devaluation of lower intelligence, this devaluation of perhaps intellectual or developmental disabilities, and this assumption that individuals of other marginalized groups are also a part of that group of people with lower intelligence. So we see these ideas, these stereotypes that low SES individuals are too unintelligent to work, or they are lazy or unmotivated, or perhaps even subhuman, right? Really just devaluing and oppressing this community. We also see on the flip side that a lot of disabled people actually are low socioeconomic status. And the reason for that, there are quite a lot of reasons, but the opportunities available to disabled people, especially in the United States, are very limiting. The physical demands of work alone can be a big barrier for a lot of people. A lot of people are not able to work. There's also a lack of access to high-paying work for disabled people. Very, very few supports in our society, especially even if someone is on disability benefits. They may be getting perhaps $700 a month to live off of. They are living in enforced poverty where they're not allowed to have more than $2,000 to their name or any kind of assets. So a lot of people are forced into this situation where they're often living with a lot of other people. They are often not able to afford all of their necessities. They are not able to live independently. And then, of course, there's also discrimination in hiring practices where disabled individuals who are able to work and who want to work may not even be able to get a job because of discrimination on the part of employers. The ADA does make that discrimination illegal, but it does still happen. A person can decide not to hire someone and never tell them that it was because of their disability. And so the opportunities that are available to disabled individuals may be limited in a way that leads to a lower socioeconomic status for many people within that community. So this has been a common theme throughout. You've probably picked up this pattern, but so many different kinds of isms and discrimination, so many insults actually pull from ableist perspectives. A lot of our everyday language is ableist. A lot of insults are ableist, and that is a very core part of our language. I have a few examples here of things that could be considered ableist language and some alternatives that you might want to consider using. A lot of people will say something is a blind spot. Even in your car, you could say that you have blind spots in your car, but you could say, I'm not familiar with this topic. This is something that's not familiar to me. I like to call the so-called blind spots in my car the blocked spots. I think it gets the same idea across. There are also a lot of insults, like calling somebody an idiot or a psycho. Those, of course, are mental health related and intelligence related insults. So you could use other words like ignorant, cruel, abusive, problematic, and so on. We also often hear people say handicapped parking or, handicapped spaces or handicapped placard. The term handicapped appeared in US history, but also in British history, where a lot of disabled individuals, because of something called the Ugly Laws, were not allowed to work and really were not allowed to participate in society. And so a lot of people were forced to beg for food and for money to be able to survive, and they would often do that by holding their hat in their hand to collect that money. So like a cap in their hand, handicapped. That's where that word comes from. And so, of course, there's a socioeconomic element to that, there is an ableist element to that, and so that term, while it means something a little bit different today and we use it colloquially in a way that is not quite the same as back then, we can always just say accessible parking instead. You can just say that's an accessible parking spot or something along those lines, and that kind of starts to move us away from that really negative history of the word handicapped. We also might often hear people say things like, it fell on deaf ears. What that really means is they weren't listening, right? Somebody wasn't listening, or it wasn't acknowledged, whatever you were trying to say. We also hear people say things like, that's so lame. Lame, of course, is an ableist slur. It means, or it was referring to people with mobility disabilities, especially people who had like a limp. So you could say instead, that's not good, that's not cool, something like that. There's also the word spaz. This again is a ableist slur. This is something that I'm only saying as an example as I'm going through these examples here. This is not a word that I would ever use. You could just say, like, my dog has a lot of energy. Think about what it really means when you're using these kinds of terms. What is the message that you're trying to get across? And can you use different words, and can you avoid using a slur to get that same message across? You also might hear people say things like, I'm so OCD. If a person doesn't have OCD, obsessive compulsive disorder, then this, of course, is very offensive to that population. You could just say, I'm very particular, or I like things to be organized, if that's what you mean when you say something like that. A lot of people will do, they'll color code something, they'll be like, oh my gosh, I'm so OCD. They might not realize that could be potentially problematic, so you could say something like this instead, like, oh, I like things to be organized, I like to color coordinate my clothes or my pens or whatever it might be. And then finally, saying something like, this exam is giving me PTSD. You could just say, this is stressing me out. Again, we don't want to be using these diagnostic labels or slurs in ways that are inappropriate. And so I'm not here to tell you what you should or shouldn't do or what you can or can't say, but I think it's important to at least acknowledge that a lot of our language is ableist, and there are a lot of alternatives that we can use instead. So if you like to kind of broaden your vocabulary a bit and avoid potentially being hurtful towards anybody in the disability community, I would at least consider changing some of these kinds of examples of language, or just be on the lookout for examples of ableist language, especially insults. There's not a lot of insults out there that are not ableist in some way, especially intelligence-based or mental health-based insults. So it's definitely interesting. Once you start noticing it, you'll kind of see it everywhere. All right, so that wraps us up for this week. We talked about a lot of different things in this lecture. I have a bit of a summary here of what we've covered. But thank you all for being here this week. I appreciate it, and I'll see you all next week for some more discussion for our class.